All right, so hello everybody, and welcome to this evening's open session. My name is Christina, just in the Hogstore Stool, and I'm the PARSE professor at the Academy of Music and Drama here at the faculty, and a member of the organizing committee for this conference. I'm about to introduce this evening's speaker, but first our Dean Ingrid is going to say a few words, and then I'm going to say something too, and then we'll go.
Hello again. You know me, I'm the person who says practical things. So, after this, there is a reception hosted by the city of Gothenburg. And I just wanted to say that you just walk out the door and you catch the avenue, and then you go right down the avenue to your left from here. And when you reach something that resembles water, you turn left, and then you're there. It's very easy, very easy. Second thing I wanted to mention is this weekend is the last weekend of the Gipka Biennial, so don't miss it. If you don't want to walk too far, you can walk up the avenue to your right when you reach it. And then there's an art, a Kunsthall, where you can see some of it, and then there are other parts of the town where you can see the Gipka Biennial, but I just wanted to remind you of that. It would be great if you had a moment and had a look. With that, thank you.
And in terms of getting to the reception, we will be walking straight from here to there, so some of us will take the lead, and also you can just follow us. We'll be turning left when we get to something that resembles water. All right, so the other thing I wanted to say before we start is just I wanted to encourage you to visit the many and splendid installations, screenings, and performances that are also happening throughout the conference. There are too many to list right here because I want to introduce Hagar, but please look at the installations and performances section of the conference website, and they're all there. So, without further ado, let me introduce this evening's speaker, Hagar Kotef. And she is a senior lecturer in political theory and comparative politics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She is the author of the quite wonderful and incisive book, Movement and the Ordering of Freedom, on liberal governances of mobility, that was published in 2015. And her talk tonight, which is entitled, and she just changed it, so I got the new title, On Eggs and Violence, an Ethics for Geographies of Exclusion. This talk reflects her current research as she is working towards a new book, which is tentatively entitled Home, the Violence of Political Belonging, or Mobility and Stability in Israel-Palestine. Although Hagar has informed me that there are about 4 alternatives to that title too, so we'll see. Hagar, very welcome.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you also and the other organizers for inviting me here. It's my second time in Gothenburg thus far, and thus far it has always been a pleasure, so I'm happy to be here. Let me adjust my Madonna device. So, part of what we were asked to address today, or part of what I thought we were asked to address, because I thought I'm under the Geographies of Exclusion thread, but now it seems no, I am? Okay, good. So part of what we're asked to address today is how different, is it okay even if I get it? Okay. How different mechanisms of exclusion, borders, barriers of different sorts, shape the experience of migration and movement in, through, between spaces. But what I want to do today instead, and as part of this larger project in general, is to shift the attention from the ability or inability to move freely to the ability or inability to stay. So I want to think about political belonging, I want to think about the production of home, including production of national homes. Now, home is an exclusionary site. It constantly creates distinctions between those who can come in and those who must stay out, between those who can stay overnight and those who must leave, between those who have keys and those who must knock at the door. Or to be more specific about it, between the members of the household and in between them, between family members and workers or servants or slaves, and between all those who are either guests or unwanted strangers. And to void to a different context between the members of the nation state and all of its outsiders, guest workers, undocumented migrants, and those who cannot even cross the border. But home is also a site of intimacy and love. And I must say that at least since the 19th century, so is the state, or so it is imagined. So there is an analogy at play here. Home is a site of attachment. Indeed, if we think of home versus, say, house, which is defined by its spatial contours, home is defined by our ability to be attached to it. And so what I'm interested to think of is the relations between this array of attachments and these practices of exclusion and violence. So I want to think about homes as they're being established in violent contexts, and specifically context of settler colonialism. And perhaps as a means of provocation, I want to do this by thinking about these chickens. But before I do this, let me give you the wider geopolitical context of this talk and actually of these chickens as well. So I want to think primarily about Israel-Palestine. And when we think about the production of home in Israel-Palestine, we need to think about several models of homes. Above all, the homes of Jewish Israelis and the homes of Palestinians. And the type of attachment to place and the relation of this attachment to violence would be very different under these different models of home. So we should also ask different sets of questions. So in regard to the home of Jewish Israelis, I basically want to ask this question. How can a home, as a spatial mark of identity and a symbol of political belonging, how can a home be produced amidst and even through destruction? How can homes become a tool of dispossession? And what are the ethical schemes that are invested in supporting homes under such conditions? How, in other words, do we develop an attachment to a place which then, and even therefore, is transformed into a site of violence? Which is basically a way of posing the question, how is settler colonialism possible? Because without this mechanism of attachment, home would be impossible under conditions of colonization. In regard to Palestinian homes, we have to ask an altogether different set of questions. How, for example, can a home, as a symbolic apparatus and a material reality, be sustained where homes are repeatedly destroyed, threatened, or being moved? If settler colonies are projects that depend upon the ability to eliminate, if not exterminate, then remove or enclose the indigenous populations, then it means that homes of indigenous populations, and Palestinians here would be an example of such a population, such homes are increasingly mobile, if not completely deterritorialized. And so these homes, as we heard this morning, are also a primary tool of resistance, because by the very insistence that she is at home, the indigenous person disrupts the colonial project. But this framing of the question as two questions, as a dichotomy, misses, I think misses significant parts of the story. Because factors such as citizenship, ethnicity, geographical location, or class further fracture this dichotomy and present us with a much more nuanced mosaic of different homes at stake. So within this rich mosaic, I want to focus on one particular model of settlement. So I want to focus on the Israeli side, and within this side, on one model of home in which violence is very much present in daily life. So it's not the violence, the structural violence of the occupation itself, and it's not even the residue of violence that is still woven into the organization of space as a reminder or remnants of the primordial act of expulsion. It's violence that is very much there constantly in its physical articulation. And I want to understand organic agriculture as the ethical scheme underpinning this violence. So this would be a way to ask the question about the ethics of dispossession in its clearest and maybe most extreme form. And let me be clear that when I say ethics of dispossession, I do not mean to say that dispossession is ethical or moral. I mean to say that people tell themselves stories about rights and wrongs, and these stories are what I refer to as ethics. This is a bit of a simplistic account, but it will do for now. So first you have to have some familiarity with these chickens. These chickens are grown in an organic farm, which means they enjoy quite a lot of space, both in the chicken coops and outside to roam freely. They eat food that is specially grown for them in the farm, organic food. And in some of the more stressful moments of egg collection, which are difficult moments for chickens, one of the farm's workers plays the piano for them, so they will be more peaceful and relaxed. So they enjoy all of the conditions that a chicken would need in order to thrive, basically. They're being raised here in the largest organic farm in Israel called Givo't Olam, which is situated here, right on the hills outside the settlement Itamar, which you can see at the right-hand side. One of the most radical, more radical settlements in Israel. The farm is the forerunner of the new settlement movement called Hilltop Youth, a movement whose goal is to basically establish outposts outside the borders of recognized settlements. The men who built the farm and the kind of guru that started this movement is this man, Avri Ran, who literally, he keeps saying, built the farm with his two hands. Ran is also quite notorious for his violence, and there are countless accounts of destruction of property, attacks, including the cause of severe injury, several criminal suits and charges against him for this violence. I want to talk to Ran in order to try to understand the relations between this violence and organic agriculture and the ethics of organic agriculture. And to be clear, part of what became very evident in our conversation is that for Ran, organic agriculture is an ethics, is part of a way of life. It's not just a business. Now, before I say anything about this relation, you may imagine in your head a certain story. It would be a story comparing the chicken coops to the neighboring Palestinian villages. It would be a story about freedom of movement of chickens versus a tight regime of movement inflicted upon Palestinians by Israel. It might be a story about care versus violence, etc., etc. But instead of comparing the life conditions of chickens to those of Palestinians, which I think is a grotesque, I prefer to ask, what are the effects of the life conditions, the conditions from which these chickens enjoy, on the conditions from which Palestinians suffer? And when we ask this question, there is a quite familiar pattern that might give us an answer. And we may call it organic washing, after pink washing or green washing, which is basically a progressive politics towards something, gay rights, animal rights, that somehow divert attentions from or hide the occupation. To put it very schematically, by practicing an ethical way of life on one level, one can then somehow cleanse the way or wash away a non-ethical way of life on another level. So the flourishing of the chickens, as it were, would provide here, under this story, an ethical scheme that portrays settlement as an ethical enterprise, dissipating the actual political conditions of violence at their foundation and normalizing their existence. Now, I think this is a compelling story. And indeed it joins many similar stories of washing or normalization in regard to the occupation and the settlements that we hear more and more in recent years. The most close orientation to this story would be, for example, Ariel Handel's story of wine washing that refers to the spreading out of boutique wineries and vineyards, most of them organic, by the way, in the West Bank, as part of an effort to reconstruct the West Bank of as Israel's Tuscany. Or Daniela Weiss's story of vegan washing, that refers to the distancing of the ethics of food production and food consumption in Israel from the politics of occupation. And she has a brilliantly titled article, I think it is called Chickens Do Not Wear Explosive Vests or something like that, talking about this process. Now, this is a compelling story, as I said, and it has its merits, but I think, can you still hear me when it's further away from the but it has at least two problems. First, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is being washed here, and how so? Because violence itself is not washed away. Violence is still there, even much more intensified with this new settlement movement. Which means that this framework completely ignores the point of view of the victims of this violence. I would presume that Palestinians could not care less about the ethical frame enveloping their injury. And in this regard, this type of thread of critiques, talking about normalization, the normalization of violence in Israel, should be distinguished from the Palestinian critique of normalization. So the Palestinian critique of normalization thinks about, or its objects, are enterprises and events that seek to manufacture symmetry between occupiers and occupieds. If you're familiar with this critique, it looks at joint football games, film festivals, commercial zones, and attacks not only the fraudulent manufacturing of equality and the masking of the infrastructure of domination, it also attacks the very assumption that even Palestinians can enjoy the benefits of normalization, be it cultural products, athletic competitions, or economic investments. And as such, the type of enterprises or events under critique in the Palestinian critique of normalization at least take into account Palestinians as their audience. Whereas the type of stories of normalization and washing I just told you now are of a very different kind. They do not assimilate symmetry. They do not create crumb situations in which Palestinians can enjoy the crumbs, right, the leftover of whatever enterprise that may be. Their audience, the audience of this washing, is merely Jewish Israeli or perhaps also friendly international spectators. So this is one problem. I'm sorry. The second problem I have with this framework is that it does not take into account how one himself conceptualizes his ethical scheme. Now, if our question is how people can live with their own violence, then we need to listen to the stories people tell themselves and others. And one's story is not one in which an ethics of non-violence towards animals somehow washes away, consciously or not, his violence towards Palestinians. It is rather a worldview that sees violence all around, part of a single order of violence in which violence needs to be managed without any pretension that it can be cleansed out or away. In fact, it's not altogether clear that he sees violence as an evil at all. One, therefore, makes no effort to hide or deny his violence. In the conversation I had with him, it became very clear in regard to his farm animals. But reporters who covered the 2 trials in which he was accused of causing severe injuries to others said he is very open and peaceful in how he describes his own violence towards other human beings. Now, his argument is very, very complex. I cannot do it justice here. I'm not sure we need to do it justice anyway. But I will try to summarize it very clearly so you get the sense. And everything I'm going to say from now on is his version, not mine. I'm just channeling his words, okay? So according to Ran, the human race faces 2 alternatives, either agriculture or a return to a model of hunters-gatherers. Now, the latter is not some romantic model of a return to nature as some naive people may think. It is actually a complete destruction of nature. And as an example, he brings the case of the oceans, a space fully governed by the logic of hunting. Now, Van expressed more outrage when he talked about fish farming. Fish farming is a really, really cruel practice. But if we look at the oceans, we see a space completely controlled by violence. Entire species have been exterminated or close to extinction. Fishing methods destroy entire habitats, and even those who object to that, Greenpeace, are portrayed by Van as a violent bunch of criminals. So if we see this, then we understand that even though it is cruel, fish farming is better for the fish themselves, okay? In agriculture, we are again facing two options, two alternatives. One is the use of synthetic fertilizers, but this is not sustainable in the long run. This would destroy the soil. The other option is a method of crop rotation and use of natural fertilizers coming from animals. And it is here, in the use of natural fertilizers, that the exploitation and cruelty towards animals necessarily reside. So there is no agriculture without abusing animals, even if we all live in an utopian vegan world in which no one consumes meat. This is his idea. So like the farmed fish, the chicken is exploited and it suffers. And in his own version of it, the Palestinians have enjoy, suffer, I don't know, a similar structure. So what Israel is doing to them is awful and cruel, but the alternatives, he says, are much worse. So they are better off where they are. It's kind of a version of enlightened occupation. And he insists. So we cannot, right? So there is no story here about we need to get rid of violence. And almost to the contrary, he insists that it is those who try to get rid of violence because they do not understand how the world operates, who end up causing the most damage and most violence. And here he talks about Anonymous and Greenpeace, but he also talks about anti-occupation activists. So we don't have here a contrast, but a symbiosis within a single order of violence, which basically amounts, all this basically amounts to one claim. Now this would be my claim, not one anymore. Usually when we think of washing, of the washing paradigm, we think of an agonistic relation. We take a good thing, right, and we wash something bad through this. Under this paradigm, organic agriculture would seem to be in some conflict with dispossession, with what it washes. But in Van's scheme, there is no tension, contradiction, or position between the ethics of care for animals and the violence of occupation. Because there is no contradiction or tension between the ethics of care for animals and violence at large. For Van, violence is part of life. This is true in regard to his animals, it is true in regard to Palestinians, and it is true in regard to himself. And maybe the best way to demonstrate it is a story he really likes to tell, and again, it's mostly how he tells it in a certain quietness and peacefulness, about how he would go to occupy another hill, so try to get hold of new territory. He would always go at the beginning on his own, and then he would be met or attacked by a group of Palestinians, probably the Palestinians whose land he was trying to take. They would injure him, he would injure them, they would leave. And then he would sit on his own with a cup of coffee, he always mentions the cup of coffee, and stitch his own wounds. Okay, so you get maybe a sense of the man. There are many ways to contradict his argument, but I'm not going to do this here. Instead of that, keep losing this, instead of that, I want to move from talking about the level of justification mechanisms and ethics, which is the ideological symbolic level, to a more materialistic approach. So I'm going to now tell you a different story about organic agriculture. Organic agriculture must take into account a variety of factors. The use of pesticides, fertilizers, the use of medicine and food supply for animals, the use of water and waste, and land. Since land is what is at stake in the question of home production, in the question of settler colonies, let's talk about land. So Israel recently adopted new-ish EU regulations that dramatically improve the spatial conditions of chickens. Yet, even under these new regulations, to grow an organic egg would require 7.13 times more space per chicken than to grow an egg laid by a chicken in battery cages, now referred to as enriched cages. So this is, right, a lot of land. One is the biggest supplier of organic eggs in Israel. To give you a sense of how big, how large it is, there are between 14 and 16 producers of organic eggs in Israel today. The yearly egg quota of one is larger than the yearly egg quota of all of them combined. In fact, one is the fourth largest producer of eggs in Israel, organic or non-organic, even though the consumption of organic eggs in Israel is merely 1% of the consumption of eggs. So this is a huge enterprise, and again, it requires a lot of land. And conveniently enough, land comes for free for one. Let's return to the map. So one has 10 chicken coops. You can see them if I do this. Can you see my, okay. So here are 2. Here is another one. Here is another 2. There are 3 over here up there on the hill. There is 1 here, and there are another 2 far, far here closer to Itamar. So just the distribution of these chicken coops and the roads leading to them means that one takes way more territory than the territory of his nucleus farm, marked here. And if you can see, the territory of the nucleus farm is very much determined by the distribution of chicken coops, both here and here. The territory of the nucleus farm is about 220 acres. If you add the distant coops and the roads and other growths, all of the territories that are cultivated by runs are marked here in green. We have here both chicken coops, grazing areas for goats, vineyards, and some other smaller produces. All this adds another 105 acres to the territory he took over. Now, the chicken coops are the primary means of dispossession of land grab. One moved to Itamar after the Oslo Agreement as part of an effort or a desire to do something against the future of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. The first time he ventured outside of Itamar was by building a chicken coop. So soon thereafter, after he moved to Itamar, he built his first chicken coop right outside the fence as an intentional process of expansion. And since then, it is primarily by building more and more chicken coops that he takes more and more land or annexes his farm. So we have here a means of dispossession in its most material sense that also grants dispossession itself some ethical meaning. But note that this ethical layer is not some positive vein that can then serve as a deferral strategy from politically questionable actions. So it's not about dissociating actions from identity. It's not about saying, I'm not this bad man eating Palestinians taking their land, I'm this good man treating chickens well. This is not what it's about for one. Right, which is what the paradigm of washing basically tells us. This ethical layer codes land grab itself, so the questionable act itself in positive colors. Land grab and organic agriculture, therefore, appear as the same order, also if we look at the practical level, the material level, not just a trans-on version of this ideology. So ethics, here the ethics of organic agriculture, but I think we can make a larger claim, is exposed not as a means to cordon off or limit or constrain violence, but actually as what allows violence to go on. And it does so not by diverting our attention elsewhere, blurring our judgment thereby, but by showing us the goodness in the violence, or the violence in... And moreover, this goodness is not easily refutable from another ethical point of view. Following Donna Haraway, I don't want to say an external ethical point of view, but I think many of us can relate to this goodness of organic agriculture as something that is indeed good. It's not the goodness of a racist person saying the world would be a better place if we get rid of some people, right? It's a goodness we can identify with, I think. So what do we learn from all this? First of all, I think it's a tale about liberalism. The liberal model often think about individuals, about liberal states, about societies, as in some conflict with violence. Violence is somehow something that is not integral to their identity. It's not who they really are. And therefore, when they are systematically engaged in the production of violence, in order to simultaneously sustain their identity and sustain the order of violence that they produce and engage with, they need some dissociation mechanism to separate self from action, to separate liberalism from violence. And we have a wide variety of such mechanisms: denial, turning blind eye, telling ourselves stories that of violence is actually self-defense or something like that. Quite surprisingly, many critical approaches adopt precisely this model of self or society. So the idea of normalization, with which I started when I told you the story of organic washing, that assumes that in order to be sustainable, the settlements require normalization, and that normalization occurs by the displacement of violence, is precisely such a model, or it assumes precisely such a model of subjectivity and self. But here we see an altogether different model of the relations between the self and violence. And as such, this talk joins the talk I gave you last time. I don't know how much overlap we have in the audience between this time and the previous time, but this is all part of a larger typology of both self and violence and the relations between them that tries to go beyond liberal understanding of the self. Last year, the model I proposed was a certain reversal of Berland's and Butler's understanding of the self as emerging from conditions of violence. I'm not sure I was able to phrase it like that at the time. But if Berland or Butler or Freud argue that the self emerges out of structures of injury, and that this injury is somehow being incorporated into who we are and into our desires, then I try to say that sometimes some of us, and maybe all of us in positions of privilege, emerge out of condition, our identity emerges out of conditions of injuring others, which means that many of us in places of privilege, including the most critical and leftist among us, become attached to these structures, even if and when these structures cause injury to others as part of sustaining our identity. And following Wendy Brown, I call these attachments wounded attachments. In my talk today, we saw a different model in which the attachment to violence is not wounded at all. It is not ambivalent, and it is very willingly embraces violence. But, and I did not say much about it, we can talk about it more later, I think it cannot be collapsed in its entirety or reduced to irrational messianism or outright racism. Though both characterize fun, to be clear, they're not sufficient to explain his model of self, and this is the rationale of talking about organic agriculture in this sense. Now, pointing to this model, I think, is important in and of itself in order to understand better the political phenomenologies of violence. But it's also important to understand what tools we need to incorporate in order to fight this model, to resist it. How am I doing on time? We're approaching the 2. Okay, so maybe I'll end at this. I will leave the political implications to the Q&A because it would require a long detour and a altogether different story. And yes, and I'll just end with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hagar. And since you were so swift in ending just then, we do have actually some time for questions. And I will try to spot you in the room and run over with the mic so that we can all hear. Does anyone want to question or comment?
Shall I begin?
Yes.
So that I can get the ball rolling.
Can we get the lights on?
Yeah. Somebody at the back.
You don't need to see us. I wondered, it was fantastic and really interesting and of course incredibly important information. Could you say a little bit more? I was particularly interested in this Freudian reversal, following Laurent and Butler, and then you mentioned Freud, the idea of emerging as subjects from, rather than from violence. I think I'm paraphrasing you badly. You talked about a character like this character emerging from violence to others. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that in relation maybe to the bigger political paradigm we were edging towards.
So we can start by talking about settler colonialism.
Yeah.
But I don't want to end with settler colonialism. I want to end with privilege at large. So we can talk about whiteness, but we can also talk about capital, eventually. In settler colonialism, identity is first and foremost the place. Most of settler colonial societies are migrant society, and what unites them as a society eventually is the location in a particular territory. Americans, who they are those living in the United States. Israelis. Okay. Now, this identity is a form of dispossession. Dispossession. One can be in that place only because radical violence has occurred, or still is occurring, usually both, towards the indigenous population. So identity is inseparable from the conditions of violence. Now, in the case of Ron, it is very clear, because what he does is constantly, what we see in his case is settler colonialism in the making, right? And maybe because it is in the making, he's less ambivalent about it. But even if we go back to the making of the Israeli state and to the very origins of Zionism, we see sometimes unapologetically, like Ron, more often than not, very apologetically, people trying to reconcile to themselves what does it mean to establish a home on the ruins of other people's home. So people need to confront constantly the violence that is part of who they are. But the point is, my point, the point I tried to make last year, is that this, who we are, and this relation to violence does not disappear once the territory has been taken over. So, as an Israeli, I am still part of this project of dispossession. Maybe no longer now when I live in London, but maybe still yes. But certainly if I lived in Israel. And this violent structure is part of my identity. If being an Israeli is part of my identity. And so we must take into account the fact that who I am is conditioned upon this violence. Why do we need to do this? Because if this is part of my identity, apologetically or non-apologetically, then we cannot solve this situation of violence by telling people, well, what you're doing is wrong. Because by telling them what you're doing is wrong, you basically confront them with who they really are, not with something that is contradicted to who they really are, like the liberal model would say. Now, the same thing we can say about people who own property. The fact that I own a house, let's imagine, when it would be easier. When I lived in Colombia, I lived in faculty housing, given to me by the generosity of the university, which would be so generous because it took these housings from people in the neighborhood who lived there before by an eminent domain. So the fact that I could enact my way of life, afford rent in the city of New York, was by taking the homes of others. We all live, not we all, but those of us who belong to positions of privilege, being a man, okay? Being a man, and I think now with the Me Too campaign, we are more and more aware of it. Being a man in our society is being a violent person. Now, it does not mean that being a man is like being run, as in going out and raping women. This would be the analogy. But it can be being violent like I'm violent as an Israeli. Be a person enjoying a status of privilege as part of a social position and causing, often unwarrantedly, often unintentionally, often just as part of this structure, constant injuries to others. And so I think we need to reconcile ourselves with the structure before we go and try to dismantle it, or as part of trying to dismantle it. I hope it was an answer.
We have time for one more short question. Did I see a hand up? Yes?
First, thanks a lot for a great presentation. My question concerns your presentation, or the images that you showed. I'm curious about several things, but two things mainly. The distinction you make between Jewish homes and Palestinian homes. It seems to me like you're not using Israeli homes.
Because Israeli would erase the existence of 20% of our Palestinian Israelis in Israel. So I prefer the term Jewish Israelis.
Yeah, okay. And the second, I just wonder what it means for the presentation. The second has to do with the portrait of this guy. Could you say something about how you understand this image?
Now I'm okay. How I understand this image?
How do you read this image? Or how do you want us to read it?
To read this image. So when I met with Ran, this is not an image I took because I did not take images because he did not know who I was because I was too scared. But there is something about this man that is simultaneously scary. You don't want to see him. I think what I wanted you to see here, right, is his strength. There is something about this image, mostly his eyes, and his look, that, at least for me, conveys both the ideology and the strength of the man. When he talked about, in one of his trials, when he talked about the injuries he caused to, it was a worker who accidentally found himself in the territories of his farm, he said, I am a strong man. Sometimes when I get violent, people get injured more than I intend them to get injured. And I think there is something about the visuality of the man here that somehow, at least for me, and maybe this is what I wanted you to see, conveys this. It is taken from a newspaper article that depicts this particular occasion.
So you want the image to portray how you think he is as a person, like how?
To the extent that you can. It's funny, he's a strange person. And part of what he says that defines him is basically that his look does not change. And so he always wears the same clothes. He always wears the same large yarmulke. And I think, as far as I know, for years and years he had this beard. So there is also something about, because he's so stable in his appearance, there is also something here about, it's kind of strange to say it, but that can convey more easily who he is, because this is how he wants to be seen. This is why he makes sure he always employs this image. And he keeps saying that if people would be scared of him, this is part of his account about violence. He said if people would be scared of him, then he wouldn't have to be violent against them because they would just not try anything. Which is precisely why he says it's anti-occupation activists, which then encourage the Palestinians to resist, and it's them who cause all the death of Palestinians. So I think there is also something that he tries to convey about himself that I think this image conveys. Be scared.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you short there, actually, because we do need to get going. The city of Gothenburg awaits us. So we say,
turn left at the
but again, exactly. But thank you so much, Hagar.